Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. Welcome to the Army Museum. There's quite a lot of feedback on this. I'm feeling a loop. Well, good luck. Good morning, and can I just thank the Deputy Director General of the National Army Museum, Mike O'Connor, for hosting us generously here today in the National Army Museum. I'm sorry the Director General can't be here for personal reasons, but I know he too has been very supportive on this event, so thank you. And it is a wonderful museum if anyone wants to come and visit. I strongly recommend it, although it makes me feel a little old to see some exhibits actually above you that I used to probably travel in is now sitting in a museum, as indeed the Challenger 1 tank, I think, that's outside. So if you want to be reminded of your age, it's also another visit to come to. It's important to be here in the National Army Museum because I can't imagine a more appropriate backdrop to what I want to say today. For here amongst the amazing collections are endless lessons from history, the successes and the failures. We all know the adage, why do they only write books on lessons learned? Because the book on lessons unlearned would be too big. In this building are great tales of bravery, examples of great leadership and battle-winning technologies. But also in this museum are the stories of British failure on the battlefield. And throughout the hundreds of years of history, whether victory or defeat, there is one constant, the junior soldier, the private, the rifleman, the guardsman, or the trooper. Whatever you call them, they are the ones who rarely get to write their own history, or indeed get a say in their future. But it was their ranks that gave the most and bled the most. And it's why good officers revere them, as the squaddy or the Tommy or the jock, often the last to know, but always the first to fight. I know from my own time uniform that to be young and to be in service of your country is indeed a fine thing. It's even finer when the cause that you are serving is a just one. But is it ever easy? Is it comfortable? Is it safe? Emphatically, it's not. It can be the most exciting thing in the world to be on operations. But luckily few of us know what it's like to be surrounded, outnumbered and attacked every day. There are some brave souls still left from the Korean War and even fewer from the Second World War who do know. It's why you also find here the permanent exhibition simply called The Soldier, not just for learning about our past and our past battles, but honouring the experiences and sacrifice of the private soldier who fought them for them. Just over an hour ago, and 1,500 miles away, the world was implored to listen and watch Red Square. This is the victory parade in honour of the 77th anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War. But really what President Putin wants is the Russian people in the world to be awed and intimidated by the ongoing memorial to militarism. And I believe that his ongoing and unprovoked conflict in Ukraine does nothing but dishonour those same soldiers. Both the ones marching across Red Square as I speak and all the forebearers they supposedly march to commemorate. Let me be clear. It's right to honour the sacrifice of those many, many millions who contributed to Europe's liberation from fascism and the Nazi reign of terror. It was a period of immeasurable destruction, atrocities and human suffering, particularly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine. There will be no mention today in Moscow, however, about much of the suffering was self-inflicted by Stalin and his generals. While in Moscow in February, I accepted the honour of laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier beneath the vast red walls of the Kremlin itself. It stands in memory of those Russians who lost their lives fighting the invading Nazis. As the inscription proclaims, the names are unknown, but their deeds are immortal. As I stood in front of the honour guard, themselves so young with such uncertain fates, even those few weeks later, my thoughts were for the ordinary Russian soldiers, so many of them conscripts who found themselves in a battle for personal and national survival against the Nazi regime. I thought about the scale of the suffering across the Soviet Union, but also how the suffering was used, then as it is now, to cover up the inadequacy of those ruling in safety and comfort from behind the Kremlin walls above and within the general staff nearby. Most Soviet conscripts hadn't a chance. Their suffering was often needless. In the absence of effective military leadership, many of their best officers were purged by the NKVD for counter-revolutionary crimes, while barrier troops executed swathes of retreating soldiers deemed unpatriotic for failing to press on in the face of unassailable odds. Fear and sycophancy dictated behaviors then, and today's Russian armed forces still carry that Soviet imprint, the imprint of immorality and corruption. Let us be honest with ourselves and be open to the inevitable charges of hypocrisy. All armies risk failure of leadership and sliding into depravity, from the dehumanizing of enemies and civilians to the reckless discharging of that most solemn power, the power to take another human's life. Because the profession of arms is at its heart the use of violent force in the defense of civilization and its most vulnerable members. And that's why in the British Army, our forces instructed at Sandhurst under the motto, serve to lead, to know that true leadership is service to their soldiers. As Wellington himself put it, I consider nothing in this country so valuable as the life and health of the British soldier. So while there may be instances of questionable competence, ill discipline and unacceptable conduct, there is also, in this country, accountability and adaptation. Could the same ever be said of Russian forces, with their quantity supposedly a quality all of its own? Do their officers serve their soldiers? Do they learn and adapt? Or do they seek only to compel and satisfy their higher commanders? Since February, we have witnessed a systematic refusal to tell the truth up the chain of command, and it's playing out. Consider the fact alone that mobile crematorium trundle around the battlefield, and not just to hide Russian war crimes. They are for their own soldiers' corpses as well. Could you imagine what it must do to the morale of a private soldier to know that your commanders have so little faith in their campaign that you are followed around by these horrific contraptions? Or let's consider the fate of a single unit, such as the 331st Guards Parachute Regiment, the allegedly the best of the best in the VDV, the so-called elite Russian airborne forces, supposedly professional, reportedly well-equipped and well-trained and well-led. At the start of the invasion, they were tasked with receiving hostile airfield on the outskirts of Kyiv, assessed to be planned as the airhead for reinforcement of subsequent operations to seize the capital. A significant proportion of the Ukrainian defenders were reservists, and despite significant Russian advantage, their resistance was ferocious and brave, with the airfield changing hands several times in the first 72 hours of the invasion. As Russian forces sought to consolidate the area, they advanced into nearby towns of Hostomel, Irpin, and Bucha. Those places, sadly, we now know, will be forever associated with the most despicable war crimes. The fighting within them was intense, and open-source footage alone shows the dozens of destroyed Russian vehicles and streets littered with dead troops. The 331st paid a particularly heavy price for having had to advance in haste without a coherent operational plan, only light air mobile armoured vehicles and insufficient combat needed to sustain such fighting. Back in the unit's hometown of Kostroma in western Russia, worried families began posting online. Some confirmed the deaths of their loved ones with loving tributes. The wife of a warrant officer wrote, "My most reliable, loving and caring husband, now you are in heaven, you will protect us. You will always live in our hearts." And as news of growing casualties spread, some posted their increasing concern and condemned the Russian military for sending them to their deaths in Ukraine. On the War of Memorial for Sergeant Sergei Duganov, one woman wrote, "Nobody knows anything. The 331st Regiment is disappearing." Others wrote that ordinary boys are dying for no good reason. The accusations President Putin had decided to play war and send thousands of guys to die. And what were all these sacrifices allegedly for on that poorly planned and badly executed operation? On the 29th of March, Russian Deputy Minister Alexander Fomin announced the withdrawal of Russian forces from Kyiv and the evacuation of a Hostomel airfield. The access of advance from Belarus to Kyiv had been repelled and was abandoned for those shell-shocked troops to now support a new offensive in the east. Ukraine's moral component had led those brave fighters to defeat the poor Russian army, poorly equipped and poorly led, and so it should have been. Today in Moscow, it should be a day of reflection. It should be a day to commemorate the suffering, albeit at such unnecessary levels, for the ordinary Russians in the Second World War. And it should be also about the culpability of Stalin and his generals, whose 1939 non-aggression pact with the Nazis allowed both sides to dismember Poland, including the cold-blooded execution of Polish officers in the Katyn massacre in March 1940. In 2020, President Putin mentioned the infamous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in another one of his long essays, this time celebrating the 75th anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War. Even as President Putin's essays go, this was a masterpiece of fiction. He brushes aside the pact, which not only saw Soviet forces train and supply the Nazi troops that they would later fight, but it led to the systematic invasion, occupation, liquidation, and transportation of occupants of Poland, Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Romania. Putin dismisses these all, claiming that Molotov Pact was an act of personal power that in no way reflected the will of the Soviet people. If that's the case, then it would be yet another example of Russian elites deceiving and exploiting a long-suffering population. But the governments did conclude, with tragic consequences for their soldiers and all the citizens of the Soviet Union. And Putin must not be allowed to raise such uncomfortable facts in an attempt to mythologize the official national history as one simply of smashing Nazism. Of course, such blatant rewriting of history is not unique to President Putin and the Kremlin propagandists. There's even the proverb that Russia is a country with a certain future. It is only a past that is unpredictable. But going in such extremes to justify this current war of choice, he and his generals are now ripping up both Russia's past and its future. Through their invasion of Ukraine, Putin, his inner circle and his generals are now mirroring fascism and tyranny of 77 years ago, repeating the errors of the last century's totalitarian regimes. They are showing the same disregard for human lives, national sovereignty, and the rules-based international system. The very system, not least the United Nations Charter itself, that we conceived together and for which we fought and were victorious together, in the hope of saving future generations from the scourge of war. Their unprovoked, illegal, senseless, and self-defeating invasion of Ukraine, their attacks against innocent civilians and their homes, their widespread atrocities, including the deliberate targeting of women and children, they all corrupt the memory of past sacrifices and Russia's once proud global reputation. The response to this failure by the Russian forces on the ground in Ukraine has in itself been a disgraceful display of self-preservation, doubling down on failure, anger, dishonesty, and scapegoating. The behavior of the Russian General Staff has shown that their own self-preservation comes first. War crimes, targeting civilians, and the casualty rates in their own battalion tactical groups are all secondary concerns. The truth is that Russia's General Staff are failing, and they know it. While I'm angry at the behavior of their army and do not in any way remove culpability from the ordinary soldier for what horrors they are inflicting, I'm equally angry at the General Staff's absence of integrity and leadership that should go up as well as down and should be expected of all professional military officers. All professional soldiers should be appalled at the behavior of the Russian army. Not only are they engaged in illegal invasion and war crimes, but their top brass have failed their own rank and file to the extent they should face court-martial. I know soldiers in the Russian army will not get a voice, and there will be thousands of mothers and wives who do not agree with this illegal war, who will be asking themselves why these things happened. They will, of course, be shamed into silence by the FSB and others. But for them, let me read the charge sheet that perhaps should be laid at the feet of the Russian General Staff. Bad battle preparation, poor operational planning, inadequate equipment and support, and most importantly, corruption and the moral component. First, battle preparation. Perhaps most importantly, Russian forces were not told what their mission was until they crossed the border into Ukraine, so they weren't even given the opportunity to prepare. There were even reports of Russian troops in Belarus selling the fuel for their vehicles the week before the invasion because they'd been repeatedly told it was just an exercise. It was no surprise that the logistics system collapsed after 70 kilometers, leaving the Russian army in the world's longest traffic jam, where they were not only vulnerable to attack, but quickly run out of food and fuel. I have no doubt that their resorting to raiding nearby communities led to many of the atrocities. No meaningful Russian air support appeared for the first week, and unable to achieve air superiority, they had a limited role in ground defence, having clearly not done any planning to support the army or integrated land operations. Likewise, Russian special forces, who've made and promoted their own macho videos openly mocking Western armies for being inclusive of minorities and women, were resoundingly defeated by Ukrainian militia, forces often incorporating minorities and women. The farce of their commanders' failures had led to certain VDV and Marine units reportedly suffering up to 80% casualties against those non-regular Ukrainian forces. And it's all because, within a military profession, they failed to conduct battle preparation. Why else were there such large numbers of first echelon supply trucks full of riot gear? Poor operational planning is the second charge. The Russians' original Thunder Run plan was based on the nationalist imperialist view the Ukrainians aren't a real culture, with the determination to resist and it to lead to those countless videos of ambushed columns of vehicles being burnt out. And despite that, the Russian generals' refusal to report ground truth for fear of their own position within the military has meant that even more forces were pushed into the traffic jam of that Kyiv convoy, even days after it was clear that the strategy had failed. The subsequent siege and bombardment strategy failed after it became clear that levels of resistance meant that at least a third of the force was required to take a single city. As the brave defenders of Mariupol are demonstrating even now, modern weapons and the moral force of a people determined to be free, to ensure their state, to ensure defensive dominance is also possible through that moral component. And that is why the Russians are failing. Throughout the Russian forces operation and across all domains, their commanders' failures to conduct appropriate operational planning has been nothing but a betrayal of their soldiers and airmen who have paid the price with their lives. Thirdly, inadequate equipment and support. Russian vehicles have not been maintained properly and immobilized many logistic vehicles, leading to cheap tyres being blown out and truck axle hub failures, all due to poor maintenance, or the money for that maintenance being taken elsewhere. As an aside, the sheer amount of footage from Ukrainian drones suggests to me they also lack a wider air defence and counter-UAV system. Almost none of their vehicles contain situational awareness and digital battle management. Vehicles are frequently found with 1980s paper maps of Ukraine in them. But it's not just ground forces. GPS receivers have been found taped to the dashboards of downed Russian Su-34s, so the pilots know where they are due to the poor quality of their own systems. The result is that whilst Russia have large amounts of artillery and armour, which they like parading, they are unable to leverage them for combined arms manoeuvre and just resort to mass indiscriminate barrages. Their limited stockpiles of air-delivered precision weapons, demonstrated by a steep drop-off in use after the second week, has meant that their air force has fallen back on dropping imprecise, dumb munitions on urban areas. On the ground, and despite knowing they were going to face anti-tank guided missiles, and all the lessons of the recent Karabakh conflict, the Russians didn't invest in effective systems to protect even their most advanced tanks. Remember the T-14? Presumably still just for victory parades. Russian soldiers, futile use of pine logs as makeshift protection on logistical trucks and attaching overhead coat cages to their tanks. It's nothing sort of tragic, but their commanders' failure to adapt before entering them into such conflict is criminal. And there is a complete shortage of all medical services, with overflowing civilian hospitals in Belarus and Ukrainian civilian surgeries being forced to provide medical aid to the same desperate Russian forces who invaded their homes. And there's the difference. Report after report I see of Ukrainian soldiers helping injured and wounded Russian forces, the noblest of all on the battlefield, to look after your enemy as sometimes they are your own. That leads me to the fourth and most serious charge that should be laid at the generals, of corruption and the failure of the moral component. Caring for your own wounded, never leaving a man behind, is one of the sacred tenets of all martial cultures. But apparently not the Russian forces. How could these generals commit their own troops, knowing they're without the necessary medical support to care for them when injured in the pursuit of orders they themselves issued? It's just another example of the moral decay in the Russian forces, rotten downwards from the Chief of the General Staff down, where ultimately the blame must lie. Conscripts taken into conflict zones, unknown and illegally against Russian law, despite recent government claims their families that no such thing would be done. Even when Ukrainian citizens have tried to indicate that buildings are sheltering civilians with signs marked out with medical or children, the Russians have largely ignored them and then created false stories to try and cover the bombings. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians forcibly relocated eastwards through filtration camps. A quarter of the population of refugees, over 2/3 of them children. Women and children raped and then murdered a terrifying echo of the Red Army's mass rapes committed in 1945, according to historian Sir Anthony Beevor. Ukrainian mayors abducted and tortured for their non-violent resistance. Abandoned Russian vehicles found full of looted white goods. Russian soldiers filmed in post offices mailing home endless boxes of stolen goods. But such open and shameless corruption does not mean a complete record of all those soldiers are. We know who they are, where they have been and what crimes they have committed. It has been created and filed, and we can use it to bring them to justice and their commanders to justice as well. Because the General's Butcher's Bill is also being paid by the many thousands of innocent Ukrainian victims of this conflict. Which I just want to say that the international community will hold to account all those responsible for these atrocities that the world is witnessing Russia's forces commit in Ukraine. We are watching, and as I've said, we are recording, because we must protect civilians and their human rights, no matter their nationality, the cause of the conflict or the perpetrator of the crime. So all those responsible, from the Commander-in-Chief to deployed tactical commanders, should know that their actions are not without consequence, and that to know is to be responsible. It is also important to recognise the countless thousands of young Russian men leaving their own mothers without sons, wives widowed, and children fatherless. Nothing more than a failure of leadership and a betrayal of command. To characterise such a situation as anything other than a human tragedy for both sides denies the reality. And to conflate it with the sacrifices of the great patriotic war disgraces the memories of the immortal regiment. Each and every one of those family portraits held aloft in parades across Russia today should realise. We all wish this senseless war did not need to be fought. Like the vast majority of the world, we cannot stand by without giving Ukrainians the means to defend themselves. That is why the British government, the whole United Kingdom, stands in solidarity with Ukraine, supporting their courageous defence of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the simple right to a peaceful and prosperous future, just as we did for the Soviet Union all those years ago. Their sacrifice in the past to defeat fascism should not be forgotten, but nor must the lessons about what lies in stores for the perpetrators of such unprovoked brutality. Shame on those who seek to use the suffering of ordinary Russians as a launchpad for their own imperial ambitions. They are the ones who truly insult the memory of the immortal regiment. So let's call out the absurdity of Russian generals resplendent in their manicured parade uniforms, weighed down by their gold braid and glistening medals. They are utterly complicit in Putin's hijacking of their forebearers' proud history, of defending against the ruthless invasion, of repelling fascism, and sacrificing themselves for a higher purpose. And now they are the ones inflicting needless suffering in the service of lowly gangsterism. And for them and for Putin, there can be no victory day, only dishonour and surely defeat in Ukraine. They might seek to control Russia's futures, but their past, through their past. But in the end, the past always catches up with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We've now got some time for questions. If I could just make a request that you identify your outlet when we come to the questions. So we've got roving mics on either side, and we'll just begin with James from the BBC, and then we'll work our way around the room.
Good morning, Secretary of State. James Landau from the BBC. Can you tell us what Britain's war aims are in Ukraine? Is Britain giving Ukraine weapons to ensure its survival as a viable, independent state in some shape or form? Or is Britain giving Ukraine the means to force Russian forces to withdraw to pre-February 24 borders, or even pre-2014 borders? Thank you.
Thanks, James. Look, I think it is to give Ukraine the means to have the freedom as a sovereign nation to choose what it wants to do, both on the battlefield and politically. You know, we, of course, don't recognise the invasion of Ukraine. We, here and now, in February, we don't recognise the invasion of Crimea in 2014. We said that was an illegal act, and Donetsk as well. So, you know, all of this has been about a sovereign nation, freely elected, having a sovereign right to choose its future. And when Ukraine asks the United Kingdom for support in being able to defend itself, we, of course, respond in that manner. But it is for Ukraine to choose how far it wishes to go. We will stand by them. We will help support them and supply them both with lethal and non-lethal aid, as is the international community at the moment. But how far they wish to take it is for a decision for the Ukrainians. It's the freedom to choose that's actually more important than what you do with that choice.
Secretary of State, thanks very much. Matt Fry from Channel 4 News. You outlined in your speech how President Putin is failing and why, but we also know that he cannot afford to fail politically. So how worried are you about an escalation of this war to NATO? And also, what are you doing, what is this government doing to prepare British society, and indeed the armed forces, for what could be a long haul and some serious sacrifices?
Well, at one level, President Putin has gone all in on Ukraine. I mean, it varies, but between 65 and 75%, all his land forces are stuck on the edge or in Ukraine. He has very little options on his conventional forces on the land. They're worn out, many of them are broken, 25% plus of his battalion tactical groups are not operational or not able to deliver. That's why you see the debate about whether he mobilizes the rest of the Russian people. So at one level, he's been exposed. His parade ground military has been exposed, and therefore his options militarily are minimal. When he was threatening some other countries recently, it was a slight question in my mind of with what. Now, at the moment, he obviously evokes all sorts of rhetoric around the nuclear options. You've heard him talk about that. But on the provocation or escalation of it, we've said, and our aim is that President Putin must fail in Ukraine. Right? He must fail in his mission to actually conquer Ukraine, which is basically what his mission was, to destroy as he's now turning it into, and he must fail in that task. The consequences of him failing is really up to him. I mean, how he deals with that foolish decision in the first place. But fundamentally, this is a man who will spin anything as a victory, no doubt. He may well have done it today. I haven't listened in full to his speech. But he must come to terms with the fact he's lost in the long run. I mean, he's absolutely lost in the long run. Russia is not what it was. It's lesser, not greater as a result of this. His armed forces have been exposed as not being this great superior armed forces that the world thought he had. Everyone thought they were sort of slightly 10 foot tall. That's not the case. The international community predominantly has come together very strongly, of all countries in Europe and Canada and in Australia, etc. So he is more isolated, lesser country, and he's lost in the long run, and we should recognise that. How he's going to deal with it is entirely up to him. How is the political system going to deal with it? And part of the speech here is about pointing out that it's not just President Putin. His generals are culpable for large parts of this, and the ordinary Russian people need to hear that those people need to be held culpable.
But sorry, just to follow up, is he going to escalate, you think, because he's too weak, or is too weak not to escalate?
He's already escalated. He's invaded a sovereign country with 70-odd% of his forces. I mean, there's not much place for him to go to escalate. And I think if you ask the countries closest to him, and I was in Finland and Norway last week, they are very clever at calculating and calibrating exactly how far to go. They wouldn't be making the decisions they potentially might about NATO membership, or certainly British and wider European presence in their countries on exercise if they thought that he was going to go over the top. And I think we shouldn't be frightened about the whole sort of provocation, or we better not do this, better not do that. What we've absolutely seen in this case is President Putin understands strength and he understands military resolve as the Ukrainians have delivered to him.
Thank you. Amy Gibbons from PA. How do you respond to Putin's claims today that the West was preparing to invade Russia, and that's what sparked their action in Ukraine?
Look, I mean, President Putin has made a number of sort of fairy tale claims for months and years now. I mean, it's literally getting, if it wasn't so tragic, it would be amusing, but it isn't. Look, no one's planning to invade. NATO is not surrounding Russia. And one of his claims is that he is surrounded. NATO accounts for 6% of his land border. Well, that's not being surrounded if only 6% of your land border is NATO. And countries he claimed that there were NATO bases in Ukraine, and I'm sure the Ukrainian ambassador will tell you there weren't any NATO bases in Ukraine. I think he is believing what he wants to believe. Slight sign of desperation, but let me put it on the record categorically. NATO, Britain, Eastern Europe is not planning to invade Russia and never has done. And then
Hi, Dan Saber from The Guardian. Returning a bit to the point about question about Britain's war aims. Is Ukraine getting the weapons that it needs to push Russia back out of the country, or at least to the 2014 borders? Is there a case, in your view, for Ukraine having heavier weapons such as tanks or possibly even jet fighters? I just want you to sort of speak a little bit more about that, please.
So Ukraine has now unlocked long-range weapons. I mean, we've got to a stage where in some of our own armoury we don't have them, so we go out and try and acquire them on behalf of Ukraine. But Ukraine has now got long-range or deep fire, so 155 guns we're now being supplied. We've seen tanks go in the last few weeks now. They have been supplied by, I think on the record you see Slovakia talking about it, or Poland certainly have put in tanks. So heavy weapons are going in. Ammunition stocks are going in. We make sure it's coordinated as much as possible. I attended another donors conference near Stuttgart a couple of weeks ago, where 40 nations, as far afield as Qatar and Australia, were there. So I think we get a daily list. I mean, myself, my ministers speak with the Ukrainians and my military on a regular basis, and we get an update. I'm sure there is more that they would like, and I certainly and the Prime Minister do everything we can to try and get as much of that as possible. I think the only real key is the debate, as you say, about air, about MiG-29s, etc., which has come forward. Now, we don't have any MiG-29s or ground attack Russian or Soviet-era type aircraft, but I've said before we'd stand by a country who makes that choice. We would defend their right to do it, and I remember saying at the time of Poland's, the discussions around Poland, that if Poland chose to do that, we would support them. And where else we do is we backfill. So we've sent more aircraft to Romania, for example, to help the Romanians be secure or feel secure, and the same will go for any other nation on the Eastern Europe. That if they wish to release some capabilities, we will do the same. And we've offered some tanks, squadrons of tanks to Poland, a British army, to go there if Poland feels that by giving away some of its tanks to Ukraine, that it is less secure. So that's the route we go to do it. But at the moment, they're getting significant amounts of heavy weapons. I'm sure they would wish more. There's also a training issue as they switch from Soviet era to NATO era, or NATO type weapons. People need to be trained on that. We offer that training, and we are supporting them in that endeavour.
Thank you very much. Tobias Elwood, Chair of the Defence Select Committee. You painted a very grim picture of the status of Russian forces, and there is a potential for Ukraine to win. But as has been indicated by some of the questions here today, there is still an absence of clarity as to what the mission is. You have a NATO summit coming up in Madrid. Is it something that you might want to press to gain clarity of the message? Would you agree that there is a direct correlation between the cost of living crisis, not just here, but across Europe, and what is happening in Ukraine because of the breakdown in grain supplies affecting food? Oil and gas is interrupted as well. It's in our interest. You said this is Ukraine to choose, but you then also went on to say Putin must fail, which I absolutely agree. But we need clarity on what that failure looks like, what the mission actually is. Is it to remove, as I'd hope it would be, Russian forces in their entirety from mainland Ukraine? That would change the optics here. It would change the dynamics in the Kremlin as well, and how Putin is perceived. And it would also give clarity to this era of instability in making sure that Europe can start to look after its own security requirements. So clarity of the mission in the Madrid summit, please.
Well, Putin must fail in Ukraine is obviously our key policy mission. But we mustn't avoid the fundamentals here, which is it is for Ukraine to choose how it ends this conflict, or how it makes Russia end this conflict, and in what manner. It would be totally wrong of me to start telling Ukraine the conditions it should or shouldn't accept. for what it's worth, whatever they choose, we will stand by them in helping deliver that. And if it's a short-term, if this only goes on for a few more months because Russia has realized it's in a fix and it suddenly wants to shift into a frozen conflict, whatever, all these different scenarios play out, it is fundamentally for Ukraine to make the choice about how it wishes to deal with the issue. And I'm not going to go a step where Britain will tell Ukraine or be counter to that. Now, whatever they choose, long or short, or all of Russia out, or back to pre-February 24, follow negotiations, Minsk, whatever they choose, it is for us to stand by them because of the values they share with us and how to get it. And I think that is something that we have to be really clear on. I'm not going to go around dictating their terms to them. That is for them. And that's been Britain's position all along. It's the same when I was in Finland and I was asked about them joining NATO. And I said, look, it's not for me to come and tell Finland to join NATO. It is only the point that it is for Finland to choose its future as a sovereign nation, and we stand by that right. That right is more important than what they do with their choice. If Finland choose not to join NATO, that's okay. Putin would love us to have a conspiracy where we're all here trying to make these countries in the East do something against Russia. We're not. People choose NATO. NATO doesn't choose it. People choose, sovereign states choose their own destiny. That's something that Putin has a problem understanding, whether they're big or small countries. That's the difference.
Geraint Vincent from ITV News. You've outlined, Minister, the limits on Putin's military options now because of his failures in Ukraine. How likely is it, do you think, that he might yet use a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield there? And what will the UK and NATO do if he does?
Look, I'm not going to speculate about issues like that. I think it is not inconceivable that large superpowers as such, and as he thinks he is, lose on the battlefield. The United States were 15 years in Vietnam, overwhelming technical advancements in their capability versus the Viet Cong. They had far more advanced equipment, far more. But the political will back in Washington in the end undermined their determination to stay, and the fact that also the Viet Cong had predominantly home advantage. They were fighting on their own soil. So it is perfectly possible that very large nations can be defeated or pushed out by smaller nations. And we mustn't forget history. Even in Vietnam in the end of the 70s, I think the Chinese invaded part of Vietnam and got kicked out. So, I don't think we should forget that it is very possible that Ukraine will break the Russian army to the extent that they either have to go back to pre-February or they have to effectively, it folds in on itself. But ultimately, the price that is being paid by Russians for their illegal invasion is a price that needs to be faced up by the Russian leadership. That's what's so absurd about today's parade in Moscow, is where is the facing up to the reality of what's happened to Russia's reputation, but also the Russian soldiers, and also what they've been doing to effectively, in a sense, their brothers and sisters. They're Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Where is that culpability? And the point of this speech is saying that one of the roles of a general is truth upwards as well as truth downwards. That doesn't happen in the Russian General Staff. Who knows what President Putin actually thinks is going on the ground in Ukraine? Just imagine if it was happening here, how long would any of us be in our jobs if that was the case? I doubt very long. History showed that even in the war in Britain, generals were removed. At the moment, it's nice parades, and apparently the air display has been cancelled because of the weather in Moscow. That's what has been declared as the reason there's no fly pass.
Hello, good morning. Robert Fox, Evening Standard. Really follows on from what Matt and James Landale have asked Secretary of State. Could you give us some idea of where this now fits the commitment to Ukraine in UK defence planning assumptions? Will there be an adjustment in the plan and the allocation of the defence budget? And also, what does the commitment on the ground to neighbouring NATO countries look like? You've talked about putting troops there. Roughly what sort of numbers are we talking about to Poland, Latvia, even Finland?
So on the troops, our current deployments are effectively part of a response to Ukrainian invasion, either to provide reassurance or containment or resilience in different countries, depending on their needs. Now, our battle group presentation in Estonia, we've doubled up, because that is, very much on the front line, and it's important to send the message to Russia that, your actions get a response. There is a squadron of tanks currently on exercise in Finland. We've just finished cold response in Norway, where over 30,000 predominantly NATO troops, but also joined by Sweden and Finland, were on exercise up in the high north. We have a squadron, I think, of Royal Engineers in Poland. We have also another force of light recce, I think it is, deployed in Poland. So we have a large splattering right across effectively the eastern edge. We've got a 6 Typhoon, it was 4, it's now 6 in Romania, and a company of infantry in Bulgaria just been deployed as well. So all of those are deployments to fulfill reassurance, containment, or resilience. The question for me to NATO is, how do you convert that into a long-term plan? Whatever happens in Ukraine, and we hope, more than anything, that Putin fails in Ukraine. Whatever happens in Ukraine, President Putin is going to be, around for some time. And, I'm afraid I am an old soldier. I remember the Cold War. I remember all of that. We have to ask ourselves, how are we going to contain him and his Russia in a way that means we provide security and safety to Europe. That involves Ukraine. It also involves NATO countries and non-NATO countries on his eastern flanks, and that's what we're trying to do. As far as the integrated view in the Defence Command Paper, we clearly identified Russia as the main adversary in that. That hasn't changed. At the moment, as I've said, our budget covers what we are required to do. I'm glad that part of my commitment, the command paper, was to modernise the Army's land fleet, which was desperately out of date. And we did get increased spending, certainly for capital, for the increase in modernising the equipment. But of course, we'll look at the lessons that we're seeing fastly coming out of Ukraine. And does that mean we should change some of those capital decisions? Or does it mean we should go back and see if there's any more funding we should ask for in the future to make sure that we fill any capability gaps? And that's really, really important. But it does go to one bit, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine is that example of partnering, where you can improve and help and support a fellow country's resilience through that partnering. It was one of the Ranger regiments that went to train just a week before, I think, Ukrainians on the NLAWs, straight in to help them deliver that, and they've been very effective in delivering NLAWs against so-called top capability Russian tanks.
Thank you, Larissa Brown from the Times. Just a couple of questions, Secretary of State. The first one, how long do you think it will be before Russia runs out of its weapons, including missiles? And also, so far today, we haven't heard Putin announce a war or mass mobilization. Do you think he's still intent on doing so? Thank you.
So on the former, look, he is running out of his precision stock fairly quickly. And, that's a lesson for us all, actually. I mean, we mustn't forget they are showing us lessons, sadly at the expense of what's happening in Ukraine. But, we all have highly complex weapons that, funnily enough, don't take a couple of days to replace. They can take months. And once you've fired them all in the way Russia has done, they have a real challenge. And I think in the long term, my point about has Putin already won or lost, in the long run, Putin trying to refurbish that armed forces is going to be incredibly hard. A lot of the components come from the West. He won't be able to get hold of those. They take months and months and months. So his stocks are low of his precision equipment, which is why it's very important we continue to supply as much precision as possible to Ukraine in defence of their country. On the second question, which was on, sorry, Professor?
Mass mobilisation.
Mass mobilisation. Well, look, I mean, I said in my quote a few weeks ago, I didn't have any intelligence about it or extra information, but, he is going to soon, well, he already is, run out of his so-called contracted army in the way that he thought he could use it. We're already we saw conscripts used quite early on. We've seen battle casualty sort of replacements made with people who are basically not well trained at all, sort of cannon fodder getting fed back into the system. I think, one of his options, obviously, if it continues to go as badly as it it does would be more mobilization to do that. But he also knows that will go right to the heart of the Russian people, and it's harder to cover up mass mobilization for a country, and this is the other sort of arrogance of their calculation, for a country where a lot of the people have relatives in Ukraine. Shoigu himself said to me that I think his mother was Ukrainian, and that they would never reject us. We would be welcome. That was the claim. And then, in fact, in the Russian Ministry of Defense, I was told that no one suffers like the Russians do. And I remember saying, well, I don't want anyone to suffer, which slightly threw them, because I think they were so partisan about it. I don't want people to suffer anywhere in an unnecessary and illegal war. But I think definitely that is one of their biggest mistakes. So how are they going to mobilize and not admit that this has gone dramatically badly for them? But it's possible.
Kylie McClellan from Reuters. You mentioned that ordinary people, Russian people, need to hear what's going on with the military, but we know they're not getting the full picture, as you alluded to in that last answer. What more can Britain do to get that message through to ordinary Russians? And do you think it ever reaches a point where the domestic pressure on Putin to change course materialises, or is it only going to come from the international community?
I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. I mean, a lot of Russians know something is wrong, or know it's wrong but feel they can't do anything about it. But it's a lot broader than I think people, we see this sort of propaganda, and yes, he's shut down so many other outlets, but there are still methods that people get. And, the Ukrainians have done issues where they get prisoners of war are ringing back and speaking to their mothers, and it'd be interesting to know how many of the parents are just in total denial, and some people are recognizing. It starts to come back. It's actually why sanctions are as important as military aid, because you can hide your military disasters, but it's very hard to hide the impact of your sanctions across the whole population. And I think that is why the governments of the international community's twin track approach of sanctions and military aid is so important. It's a really important aspect for his population. But I think a lot of people do know, brave people know. They knew when the Kursk, there is political effect in Russia when the Kursk happened, and that was all covered up. They knew in the first Chechen war, it does get into society, and when you start to lose thousands and thousands of people, and remember you're getting thousands and thousands of injured people, so for every, the Ukrainians estimate 22,000 Russian dead. Let's say we're ultra conservative and say 15,000. You roughly got to add 3 to 1 of injured people. There's another 45,000 people coming home injured, maybe 50. That's hard to cover up. I think even the most loyal Russians won't buy the weather forecast excuse on aircraft today.
The Polish Defense Attaché, Colonel Malek. Mr. In your assessment, how do you assess unity of NATO towards support of Ukraine, especially as a non-EU member now? And if it was not Ukraine, but one of NATO members invaded, taking into account different national interests of many countries, do you think that NATO approach would be different? Thank you.
First of all, NATO, Article 5, it's very explicit. Secondly, the unity of NATO. Look, the unity of the international community is something that Putin's completely got wrong. There is a benefit of having a big NATO of 30 nations. We have actually been very unified. And actually, yes, some countries move at a different pace on the subject, but you've got 30 countries. So you can find plenty of countries to address one problem and another to move at a different pace. So, for us, obviously, military aid was one of our key drivers. There's been plenty of nations across the whole of NATO who've been prepared to stand up with large amounts, certainly proportionally large amounts of that equipment, and also countries who really are on the front line. If Putin were to try and broaden it, they're the ones. So I think I come away very positive. I think NATO's been very unified. I think the EU's actually been very unified on its sanctions. Of course, we'd like a bit more, but it is there. The international community has been unified, and I think Putin did not calculate that at all. Now, we'll see what happens next, but I think some countries give Russia quite a lot of leeway, but in the end they get to the same place where we've all got to. The Italians allegedly, I think I saw that in the open media yesterday, seized a super yacht yesterday, and we don't have so many super yachts around this country at the moment. I see. So don't know why. One more. There we go. Done. Right, do the back. Sorry, we'll the microphone coming towards you.
Thanks very much, Secretary of State Dominic Penner from The Telegraph. Further to the idea that the UK will basically, as you suggested, meet Ukraine with wherever it wants to be in terms of its objectives, do you want to see defence spending increased in the autumn in order to fund that? And what could the consequences be if our defence spending doesn't increase?
The chair of the Defence Select Committee shouting 3%. Look, I've always said as the threat changes, so should our funding. No different from other parts of government. If pressure on the NHS goes up, that gets met with money. If threat changes, then that should. If it goes down, be prepared what you wish for, because if threat goes down, maybe defence spending. So look, I think it's up to me to present a case about the threat and what we need to do to counter it. And then it's a discussion about government, about its appetite. For decades, defence spending has been at risk for a number of things, but one common risk has been government's appetite has never matched its budget. It's done more than it can afford. And I think what's been really, I'm determined to do in the Defence Command paper was to tie down the government's appetite about what it wants to do and how far it wants to go with its funding. And there's no point kidding on that we could do more than we could. And I think we have told ourselves for decades we could do an awful lot without being pretty blunt about saying, that's it. I mean, I said not so long ago to someone, that's it. When the money runs out, that's it. We're not doing any more of this. And there was a sort of pause. That's just the way it is. Now, we should have that debate. I know Tobias and others would say that the debate it does warrant more because it is a more insecure world. It is a dangerous world, actually, at the moment, and I do agree with that. But at the moment, with my spending for this year and last year and next year, I'm in a sound position. The long term is as much about what NATO plans. I mean, I think we have to ask NATO, what is your long-term plan? It is amazing how many of the Cold War things have been shredded or taken off the books, and actually we should ask ourselves, how are we going to deal with a Putin or a Russia post-Ukraine?
Secretary of State, what is your assessment of Putin's state of mind at the moment? Do you still think, is there an official understanding of how he is and what he might do?
I can only see. I mean, I always say that some people say Putin doesn't lie. I mean, you look at his writings, you look what he believes. He wrote about Ukraine last year. It was very clear his views. If you read his essay or article or whatever it was on 75 years of the Second World War, it's pretty clear that what you see today in his speeches is exactly what he says then. So I don't know what his state of mind is, but it's not going to plan. I mean, we'll see. I'm not going to speculate on his state of mind. Who would? Right, okay. Thank you, guys. Thank you.